Okay, so let me just give you back your quizzes from the last couple of sessions now that everyone's taken. On the whole, you guys are doing fine on these, right? I think that you're actually doing quite well. So generally speaking, I'm happy if most of you are getting a 75 most of the time. That means you are sort of paying close enough attention to detail that you are grasping what you need to grasp. If you find you are having trouble with the kind of attention to detail that I'm asking for, here's what I would suggest. One thing you probably want to do when you're reading is slow down and make sure that you are doing so in a quiet, distraction-free environment if possible. Right? I get that this is not always possible. The other thing that you probably want to do, what do you notice about what my book looks like? Yeah, scribbled all over it, right? So whenever I have a thought about something that I'm reading, right, I just make a note here in the margins. Now again, like if you rented your textbook, you probably shouldn't do that, but you can use sticky notes, right? So in general, like this is actually a really good aid to memory. If you actually have your thoughts on what you're reading right next to what you're reading, it'll help you to recall things better. So this is something that I would recommend. Also, we are coming up, not soon per se, but also not soon, on midterm, which means, that it's probably not a bad idea to start prepping for the exam, and I will also pass out the assignment for the first paper on Wednesday, so that you have plenty of time to prepare for that. One thing I would suggest you all start doing for the exam, right? So as we go over the vocab words every Monday, start making flashcards with them. Right? Put the term on one side, put the author, the text, and the definition on the other side, and just when you have time, just kind of go over them. Right? And this will help reinforce them by the time we get to the exam. So does anybody have any questions about anything coming up? Okay, I do want to note as well that the week of the 23rd, I might not be here. I still have to kind of figure out what's going on here, but I got called up for jury duty on the 22nd. So I may have somebody else in here to cover for me, depending on what's going on that day and whether I can get somebody who is versed in whatever that is. I may just give you a video of an old class to watch and a quiz. But yeah, we'll figure that out when we get there. I'm hoping that when I get, when they interview me, they will see that I'm soft on crime and let me go. All right. So, for next time, you are reading the excerpts from Dorothy Wordsworth's Alfoxen and Grassmere journals, right? And let's just quickly go over the vocab quiz from last time, just to reinforce this stuff, right? All right, so, greater romantic lyric. Somebody remind me what the greater romantic lyric was. Or is.
It was a three-step process where you start with the observation of that environment, and then you do the self-examination, and then you the result of it, and then you apply it to whatever you're doing.
Exactly, yeah. It's these romantic era poems that follow this outside, inside, outside pattern, right? Good. And what text would we attach that to? What's the best example of a greater romantic lyric that we've looked at this far? Actually, really the only example. Yep, William Wordsworth, Tinternet. Good. All right. The Talking Book. What's the Talking Book?
fit for British society you wanted it.
Yeah, right, good. Yeah, from Equiano's interesting narrative, right, yeah, it's that he sees his master and his friend talking to books, right? But when he tries to pick up the book and listen to it, it doesn't say anything to him. Right? So yeah, as Colin said, it is emblematic of his continued cultural exclusion. Right? Good. Defamiliarization. What is defamiliarization?
When an author uses something familiar to the audience and makes it unfamiliar to garner that sensibility.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're showing your reader what a familiar object looks like to somebody who has never seen this before, right? So, to someone like Wordsworth, this is about reawakening your sensations, right? To someone like Equiano, this is about building up sympathy through cultivating sensibility, right? All right, good. The Wye Valley. What was the Wye Valley?
It was a picturesque place that was very popular for walking tours.
Yeah, it's a river valley along the Welsh border, the border between Wales and England. It was popular for walking tours. Actually, quite densely traveled and also industrialized. And what text is this important to? What text does this matter to? Yeah, this is where Wordsworth is taking his walking tour in Tintern Abbey, right? Good. Condition versus states.
Condition describes like the material condition status, whereas state was the legal status.
Yes. Yeah, so these refer to slavery, right? And yeah, condition is the material conditions under which slaves are kept, like how they're treated, right? And state is their legal status as someone else's property. So you could attach this to Equiano, you could also attach this to Thomas Clarkson, right? Or, probably also to Coleridge and Cobble. Pantheism. What is pantheism?
Believe that everything is wrong.
Yeah, the belief that everything is God and that God is in everything, right? This one's probably going to come back today. And what text do we apply this to? Pardon? Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey? Yes. This is Wordsworth again, right? Okay. Sons of Africa. Who or what were these sons of Africa?
So they were a group of black British men around the area of London who wrote letters to each other in order to join efforts in the abolition of the slave trade.
Yeah, and then they formed a kind of lobbying society, right? They had lobbied parliaments to pass legislation restricting and then eventually abolishing slavery. But yes, and Oluwuda Equiano was a key member of this group. All right, the Picturesque. What is the Picturesque? This is something that's going to come back up with Dorothy Wordsworth and also when we talk about Romantic Orientalism in a couple of days. What is the Picturesque?
So like the sublime to experience in awe.
Yeah, so yeah, it's essentially a way that like someone can frame sublime image or experience, right? But kind of put the viewer at a safe distance from it, so that you can kind of simply like admire it disinterestedly, right, rather than feeling overwhelmed or terrified by it. And these kinds of little picturesque scenes were set up all along the Wye Valley. So this is also relevant to Tintern Abbey. All right, just two more here, right? Who was Michael Henry Pascal?
He was one of Becca's slave masters that changed his name through violence and silence and forced compliance.
Yeah, he's a ship's captain, and in the two episodes that we really see him in Equiano's narrative, right, he is forcing Equiano to comply with something he doesn't want to do through violence, right? First changing his name, and then selling him to another ship's captain, right? All right. And last one, again, relevant for today's discussion, lyrical ballads. What was lyrical ballads?
It was a democratic revolution in impetus. Piece of work put together by Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Yeah, it's the poetry collection that Wordsworth and Coleridge put together. And it's informed by all of those ideas you mentioned that they have in common. The basic idea behind lyrical ballads is an attempt to try to revolutionize British poetry, right? To sort of like move it forward by means of what I'm going to call this, or what I'm going to say, we're going to kind of segue just into today's discussion now, right? The historians Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger use a term that they call invented tradition. And an invented tradition is something that is actually an innovation, right? It's something that's actually brand new, but it's presented as though it's a revival of something older, right? So, one thing that we find in a lot of Romantic poetry is a reliance on certain kinds of medievalisms, right? They like sort of pseudo-Gothic landscapes and settings. And a lot of appeals to folk tradition. For example, in the kinds of stanza forms and the kinds of meters that a lot of the early British Romantics choose to write in. So, if we just look at this title here, Lyrical Ballads, do we all know what a lyric is? What's a lyric? Okay, yeah, that's the way we tend to use it now, and indeed that actually kind of harkens back to its original meaning, right? Greek lyric poets would play a small harp called a lyre, right, to accompany themselves while they were reciting. But a lyric poem is a relatively short poem, right? It's non-narrative. And it's intended to convey an idea or emotion, right? Instead of telling a story. And so lyric, because this is one of the classical Greek genres, right, then belongs to that high art tradition. Now what about a ballad? Does anybody know what a ballad is? All right, I will take your generalized silence to mean no. Okay. So ballads are a folk form, usually orally transmitted. And because they're orally transmitted by people who are often illiterate or semi-literate, there tend to be many variant versions of any given ballad. And ballads are narrative, right? Ballads usually tell a story. But they usually only tell a small part of the story, right? They begin what's called in media res. Does everybody know what that means, in media res? Anybody familiar with this term?
Is it in the middle?
Yeah. It's Latin, it means in the middle of the action. And we really only get whatever the climactic moment is in the story. And ballads are also recognizable by their very kind of they have a very characteristic stanza shape, right? It's very kind of sing-songy, it's easy to remember, and it's easy to adapt to different content, right? So the ballad stanza is 4 lines. The rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, and it alternates between 4 and 3 stressed lines. So to give you an example, one of the best known ballads is it's kind of first recorded in the Scottish Borders. It's called Sir Patrick Spence. And the first stanza says like, the king sits in Dunfermline town, drinking the blood-red wine. Oh, where will I get, good sailor, to sail this ship of mine? And then if we look at the first stanza of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner on page 448. It is an ancient mariner, and he stopped at one of 3. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stopp'st thou me? So Coleridge has taken and adapted this folk form, right, these ballad stanzas, for a long narrative poem that is frequently met in this class anyway, like, when I've taught this in the past, with a good deal of confusion. So one thing I guess I do want to know before we proceed here, have any of you read this poem before, like in high school or other classes? So this is everybody's first encounter with it?
Just since it was before, but never through the whole poem that we read for here.
Okay. And yeah, the music that I was playing as you were all walking in was the British heavy metal band Iron Maiden's interpretation of this. It's basically a Spark Notes version of the poem with an 8-minute bass solo stuck in the middle. Yeah, so that kind of speaks to the whole snippets of the poem that just go like, there are parts of it that have kind of entered popular culture and popular conversation. So what did y'all think of this? How did it go for you?
I was really mad that he killed the bird.
Okay.
I thought that was rude.
Okay, yeah, that's a pretty shitty thing to do. Yeah.
Especially since it was like a good offering.
Uh-huh. And the bird is, it behaves almost like a pet, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's tame. It, comes to the ship to, play with the sailors and be fed, right? And then does he ever give any explanation for killing the albatross? No, it seems to be like completely motiveless murder of an innocent creature, right? So that's kind of like one of the central mysteries of this poem, right? Is like, why does he kill the albatross in the first place? What does that mean? Was there anything else that y'all found particularly kind of like interesting or confusing here?
In terms of like lyrical ballads and things of that nature, the reading of it seems weird if you've never, like, this is, if I remember, or at least in a long time, this is my first encounter with lyrical ballad like this, and it's just the way it's structured.
Okay.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. Can you elaborate a little bit on it? Like, what's interesting or weird about the structure here?
Well, the way it's structured just down to the first four. What are they called?
Stanzas?
Yes. Thank you. It was trying to follow that structure of an introduction because usually with poetry, the introduction and trying to set a scene usually throws me off. It's like one of those things where I have to take a few reads or read descriptive narratives that people have come from those to set that introduction. It uses what to us, I guess, is more uncommon language.
Yes. So this is actually one place where Wordsworth and Coleridge differ, right? Wordsworth's whole theory was about speaking to people in plain language. Coleridge often tries to resurrect old-fashioned or archaic language, right? So a lot of the words that he uses in this poem, by 1798, when it's first published, are words that are no longer in use in English, right? Like people in 1798 aren't walking around saying eftsoons, right? So he's using deliberately old-fashioned language. And in fact, the 1798 version of this poem is actually more archaic in terms of its language, right? It also uses a lot of old-fashioned spellings. Wordsworth believed that one of the reasons the original publication didn't sell that well was because people couldn't read the friggin' Ancient Mariner because of Coleridge's weird spellings. So for the next edition, Coleridge revised it and updated and modernized some of the spellings. But yeah, so he's doing that on purpose, right? He's using archaic language, he's using old-fashioned language on purpose. And another thing that he's doing here, you notice what's going on in the margin of the poem? What's he doing there?
It's kind of almost like, it feels like a puzzle. It's a summation of what you just kind of read.
Yeah, he's giving you what are called marginal glosses, right? Which also didn't appear in the original publication of the poem, but were added later to help for two reasons, right? One, to help explain the action to the reader, and two, to try to mimic a 17th century scholarly text, right? The way scholarly books used to be structured, particularly in the late Renaissance, was like so that you didn't have to kind of go reading through, there was no table of contents, or you didn't have to go reading through the whole book to figure out what you were looking for. There would be these glosses in the margin that would tell you what the author was about to talk about. So he's imitating that particular style there. So he's accomplishing two things at once here, right? He's summarizing the poem for you as you're reading, but he is also making it look like a more old-fashioned kind of text. And this also, the idea that like the marginal glosses here too, also kind of help combine the folk form, that ballad form, right, with a scholarly tradition, which is very much in the spirit of what Lyrical Ballads is trying to do overall, right? So drawing on ideas that are old and even language that is old to try to create something that is really kind of entirely new. So, if you had to give me a synopsis of the poem, just a summary of what happens in the poem, right? What's the basic plot of the narrative here? What happens in this poem?
Well, let's say from part to part, in the first part, he stops, so what he has to tell of his story.
Okay, yeah, so the first thing we've got is we do have this frame narrative, right? The story of the killing of the Albatross and its results is contained within this other story, right? Where the ancient mariner stops the wedding guest and tells his tale. Okay, what is the first important event in the mariner's own tale? What happens in the mariner's own story?
Along this group is stuck in the ice.
Yeah, he and his shipmates are blown off course, and they end up in this kind of icy wasteland, right? And then what happens?
The albatross comes in.
Yeah, Albatross appears. Right? The mariner shoots the albatross. And then what?
His shipmates get mad and why would you tell something of such like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his shipmates get angry with him. They hang the dead bird around his neck, right? And the ship gets stuck. And everybody's, the ship is becalmed and everybody's getting dehydrated, right? And then when the ship is becalmed, what happens?
His crew dies.
Yeah, we have this weird episode of these two allegorical death figures, right, playing a dice game, right? The woman shouts that she's won, right? Apparently the only one she wins is the Maryland, right? So everyone else dies. And then what?
He's not able to die. No matter the start, he goes, what was it, without food and water, and stays on the ship.
Yeah, he's just, yeah, there's like, he continues to live on, he doesn't know why, right? And he looks down into the sea and he sees all these slimy creatures down there. He's angry because these things are still alive and all of his shipmates are dead, right? And then when he learns to bless the slimy things, right, the albatross falls off his neck. The rain falls and the zombie crew start manning the ship again, right? And then what happens? I feel like if we can kind of break this down into a series of discrete episodes, it'll help us understand better what's going on here overall. So the zombie crew gets the ship moving again at fantastic speeds, right? What happens when he gets in sight of land?
There was a ghost being
Yeah, there's this conversation between the two voices, right? Right, they're asking questions about whether he's done sufficient penance or not. And then once he gets in sight of home, right, the ship sinks. And he's rescued by the pilot and the hermit. And then we learn that he is compelled at various points to go out and tell his story to some individual that he is somehow able to identify by something like magic, right? It's like, I know the man who must hear me, right? And you, poor wedding guest, are the lucky bastard today. So one thing that might help us here, right, if we're trying to break this down and understand what's going on, it might help us if we think about what we already know about Samuel Taylor Coleridge, right? This isn't the first time that we've encountered this guy. So let's think about other contexts in which we've discussed Coleridge and his work. There are other things we've seen that he's written. What do we already know about Coleridge? From his other writings. was the first place we encountered Coleridge? Yes. He wrote that review of the monk, right? And what was Coleridge's overall attitude towards the guy? What was his attitude towards the monk?
He wasn't, if I remember right, he wasn't favorable towards it. He thought it was taking morality away from society.
Yeah, he was interested in the supernatural incidents, right? But he was bothered by what he saw as a lack of morality in the story, right? So we learned from that he is interested in the supernatural, but he is also, at least to some extent, animated by the belief that art should have some kind of moral content, right? Or at the very least, that it shouldn't be morally degrading. Then where else have we encountered Coleridge? What other prose writings of Coleridge have we read?
And he wrote about the boycott.
Mm-hmm.
Don't remember the name of it.
Yes. He gave that lecture on the slave trade, right, in which he encouraged people to boycott cane sugar and its byproducts from the West Indies, right? So we know that he is anti-slavery. And that he understands how the Atlantic trade triangle works, right? That he has some notion of slavery as a kind of economic system. And does anybody remember another point that he made in that essay, kind of like about that could be related to art or to art theory? What was his attitude towards this 18th century idea of sensibility? Y'all got this on the quiz. Did you think sensibility encouraged anyone to actually be more moral?
There's no connection between sensibility and benevolence.
Yeah, good. That sensibility, yes, does not mean to benevolence or to moral improvement, right? So merely presenting objects of sympathy to people's senses isn't enough to get them to care about, genuinely care about other people, right? And one more thing that I think we mentioned, but is also kind of relevant, but is also kind of relevant to Coleridge's larger interests, is his involvement in a scheme called Pantheism. Or this is the thing he was trying to raise money for by giving those anti-slavery lectures. He and his friend Robert Southey wanted to found a utopian commune in Pennsylvania, which would be run on kind of strict egalitarian principles, right? Equality between men and women, equality between all members of the community, right? So this is the basic set of concerns, along with this interest in ballad forms, that is going into the making of this poem. Right? What I want to try to do over the next half hour or so is going to tease out how some of these particular interests of Coleridge's inform what's going on in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which seems like a weird story about a guy who shoots a bird. But there are two other, really I guess one other context I want to mention here. There is, in the late 18th century, a real appetite for narratives about sea voyages. And a lot of this is kind of excited by the well-known voyages of Captain James Cook. Between 1772 and 1775, so about a little over 20 years before Coleridge writes this poem. Coleridge studied under Cook's astronomer, a guy by the name of William Wales. And Cook didn't actually discover the continent of Antarctica, but he believed there was a landmass there. And he crossed the Antarctic line several times. So he was trying to find something like, something down there and all that snow and ice, all those icebergs down there. So Cook's voyages may very well have been a kind of direct inspiration, particularly on the part of the poem in which the mariner and his shipmates kind of get stuck in this icy wasteland, right? So let's kind of try to dig into the poem a little bit here and see what we can pull out of it. Let's begin at the beginning. Can I get somebody to start reading from the beginning of the first stanza?
It is an ancient pyramid and stocked full of three. Are they long gray beard and glaring eye, now therefore stocked from? The bridegroom's doors are open wide, and I am next of kin. The guests are not, the feast is set, and he is straight a merry thing. He holds him with his skinny hand, or with a ship full of food. Hold off the hand me greater boon, that soon his hand drop me. He holds him with his glaring eye, and one guest sits still, and listens on the breeder's trial of the mariner half his will.
Okay, thank you. So let's pause here for a second. I think it's important to note here what the mariner is interrupting. Where's this poor what is this poor bastard he stops on his way to? Yeah, he's on his way to a wedding feast, right? And so this seems like a kind of like fairly obvious everyday thing that most of us never really think much about, right? But when we get down into the details of it, what is a wedding feast? Like, what does a wedding celebrate?
Marriage.
Okay, yeah, it's a union of two people. And is it just two people who are united?
Two families.
Yeah, two families, right? Right. In the presence of all of their friends and relations. So a wedding is it's a celebration, really kind of like the formation of a new community, right? And I think this is kind of particularly important as a kind of contrast to the mariner's experience within his tale, right? So he's stopping someone from going to this kind of communal celebration. Now, what do we know about the mariner's relationship with his shipmates? If we think of the ship as a kind of floating community, right? What's the mariner's role within that group? What's that?
Lead.
Well, we don't really know what his position is strictly on the ship. Right? If he doesn't seem to be the captain. Does he seem to behave in accordance with or against the rest of the crew? Yeah, he's always singled out, right? He's always different from the others in some way. Right. First, in the treatment of the albatross, right? The others love the albatross. The mariner decides to kill it. And then, when everybody is essentially being baked to death by the sun, he's also the only survivor, right? So once again, he is kind of picked out from the group, right? Separate from the group. In some sense, like some critics read the whole alone on the sea portion of this as a kind of allegory for spiritual alienation. But he's by himself, surrounded by corpses, with no one and nothing to talk to. Right? Can I get somebody to read for us if we go to part 4 here? Can one of you please read for us the part that starts with alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea?
Alone, alone, all alone, alone on a wide, wide sea. And never a saint took pity on my soul in agony. The many men so beautiful, and they all died did lie. And 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. I looked upon the rotting sea, and drew my eyes away. I looked upon the rotting deck, and there the dead men lay. I looked to heaven and tried to pray, but wherever a prayer had gushed, a wicked whisper came and made my heart as dry as dust. I closed my lids and kept them close, and the balls like pulses beat. For the sky and the sea and the sky lay like a load on my weary eye, and the dead were at my feet. The cold sweat melted from their limbs, nor rot nor weak did they. They look with which they looked on me had never passed away. And the orphan's curse would drag to hell a spirit from on high, but oh, more horrible than that is the curse in a dead man's eye. 7 days, 7 nights I saw that curse, and yet I could not die.
Okay, thanks. We can pause here, right? So what's the situation described here? What stands out here to you?
It's that contrast of life and death. And
Mhm.
the fact that the way it's like all of the, in the one stanza where he describes all the many men as beautiful and the thousand slimy things. That
Yeah.
contrast of the beautiful versus the ugly.
Yeah, and we also have that kind of like differentiation between human and animal life, right? Much like we had with the albatross there, right? He didn't value the life of the albatross at the same level as a human life. And he doesn't value these thousand slimy things either, right? So yeah, there's an ugly, beautiful, human-animal binary that's set up here, right? Good. And what is he trying to do here but unable to?
Right?
Yeah, yeah. He's trying to pray, but he can't. Right now, some of that might also be the dryness of the throat, right? But I think that is kind of speaking to the same kind of spiritual dryness here, right? Once they all decide to share in the crime of killing the albatross, right? Then they're all punished. They all kind of like dehydrate to death, right? There's also there's a way in which that links into the whole slave trade idea as well, which we'll get to in a minute. But why do you think there's so much reference here to the eyes of the dead man and the look that they're giving him? What do you think is going on with the eyes?
What seems like a lot of religious theme and just the things of life and death in general, like the path of the fact that when you say eyes are like the path of the soul.
Okay.
Something like that, seeing somewhat, it causes that further pain that he's feeling. It shows that, because they also talk about him not decaying, the dead man not decaying or rotting.
Uh-huh.
So it's just that visible of somebody who's alive and not at peace. Just seeing them lying on the ground, dead, that those open eyes causes that further.
Yeah, the eyes still open, glaring at him, right?
Yeah.
Reminding him that this is his fault. And I think it also probably would help if we think about like what happens at the very beginning of the poem again. Like, what does the mariner use to fix the wedding guest in place? Yeah, it's his glittering eye, right? So there seems to be almost like a power of mesmerism here in the eye, right? Whether one is living or dead. So yeah, the eye here seems to be this kind of center of power, enough power over others, like recognizing the sin in others, maybe. And then let's continue here with this. Can I get somebody to start reading from The Moving Moon Went Up the Sky?
The moving moon went up the sky, and it fell where it near about. Saw that she was going up, and a star to the south. The beams do not burst, sultry main, or April nor frost spray. But when the ship's huge shadow lay, the charmed water burned away.
Mhm.
But still and awful there, beyond the shadow of the ship, I watched the water snakes. They moved in tracks and shining light, and when they reared the elfish light, fell off and were flames. Within the shadow of the ship, I watched the riches higher, blue, glossy green, and velvet black. They pulled and swam in every track. It was a flash of golden light. Oh, happy living things, that tone that beauty might and live. A spring of love gushed from my heart, and I blessed them all. Should my crown sink to pity on me, and I blessed them all. The self-same moment I could pray, and from the necks of me, that albatross fell off and the sunlight flowed into the sea.
Okay, thank you. So, what happens here? What changes in this second half of part 4?
It's actually like seeing the sea creature sneaky.
Yeah, they're not a thousand slimy things anymore, right? He sees the beautiful trails the water snakes are making, right? And, he is able to recognize them as having a beauty and dignity that he didn't see before. And once he does that, the albatross falls from his neck, and then in part 5, the rains start coming down again, and the crew comes. Well, they don't come back to life, but they're animated, right? And stumble around the deck and do zombie shit. So, what we have here is a kind of pantheist, at least what we seem to have here maybe, right, is a kind of pantheist argument, right? That what he needs to learn is to recognize that all things human and animal are one, right? That all things human and animal have the same kind of divine spark in them. I think this kind of speaks to the speech he gives at the end of the poem to the wedding guest. If we turn to page 463, and can somebody read for me the part that begins with, "O wedding guest, this soul hath been"?
Where is that?
Page 463. It's around line 597.
The wedding guest the soul hath been, and one alive on sea. So many times that God himself scarce seemed there to be. O sweeter than the marriage feast, 'tis sweeter far to me, to walk together to the kirk, with a goodly company. To walk together to the kirk, and all together pray, while each to his great Father bends, old maiden babes and loving friends, and youths and maidens dear. Farewell, but this I tell, to be thou wedding guest. He prayeth well who loveth well, both man and bird and breast. He prayeth best who loveth best, all things both great and small. For the dear God who loveth us, he made and loveth all. The mariner, whose eye is bright, whose beard with ages worn, is gone, and now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's shore. He went like one that hath been stung, and is of sins forlorn. A sadder and wiser man, he rose the morrow morn.
Okay, thanks. So what does the mariner's argument add up to here?
Appreciate all things made in love.
Yeah, appreciate all living things, right? Treat all as one. Allow nature its dignity, right? Were you about to say something, Grace?
No.
Okay.
It was kind of just that.
Okay. And what does he argue is best in life? What is the thing that everyone should be doing?
Love or pray.
Yeah, love and pray together, right? As a community, right? Everybody march together to church and pray together, right? Is there anything that seems a little ironic about this, given other circumstances in the poem? For example, what is the mariner interrupting?
In love and stuff.
Yeah, he's interrupting exactly this kind of thing, right? He's interrupting this kind of big communal celebration and stopping this guy, singling him out, and preventing him from entering, right? And then what do we learn about the wedding guest's future fate here?
He's more sad but wise.
Yeah. He went like, now the wedding guest turned from the bridegroom's door, right? So he turned away from the communal celebration. And then a sadder and a wiser man, he rose the morrow morn. So, what's the upshot of this great insight for him? What does this do to the wedding guest? Does the story seem to do what the mariner says it's supposed to do?
Seems to turn them away from people rather than being confused.
Yeah. At the end of this poor fucker is just as alienated as the mariner, right? And he didn't ask for this, right? This wacko just showed up, sat him down on a stone, and made him listen to this tale, right? So through no fault of his own, he's been cut off from from this larger community, right? Whereas the mariner's alienation seems to have been pretty much his own fault, right? Everything in this story can be traced back to his own actions. The wedding guest is just kind of the innocent victim of the mariner. Whether the mariner means to do him good or not, right? And this is the really kind of weird and troubling thing about this poem. I'm never really sure what to do about this, right? I'm never really entirely sure how to read this because it is bloody confusing. Now, I think it might help if we look at some of the slave trade context of this to help us figure out some of what's going on and maybe where some of the mariner's moral blind spots are. But I've never really been able to resolve this in a way that I find satisfactory. So, one of the ways this relates to the slave trade is that we can actually kind of trace geographically the mariner's journey, right? So he leaves from, this is kind of vaguely England and Wales shaped, right? And then Scotland maybe a little too small, but so he leaves from a port in England, probably Bristol. And he tells us that they sail below the line, so they're sailing towards the equator. Probably, in fact, almost assuredly, given what we know about British trade and shipping, right, to West Africa. Right, then they are blown far off course to what seems to be Antarctica, and blown even further off course into the Pacific Ocean. Right? So some of these seem around the Americas and come up into the Pacific. So the suggestion that the mariner is engaged in slave trading is a pretty strong one, given where he seems to be headed. And given his general callous attitude towards life. The other thing that suggests slave trade context here is the way the appearance of the men is described as they are as they're dehydrating on the ship. Their physical appearance. Okay, on page 452, right? Their throats unslaked, with black lips baked, we could not laugh nor wail. Through utter drought, all dumb we stood. I bit my arm, I sucked the blood, and cried, "A sail, a sail." With throats unslaked, with black lips baked, agape they heard me call. Gramercy they for joy did grin, and all at once their breath drew in as they were drinking all. So the black lips in particular here, coupled with the dehydration, are suggestive of yellow fever. Right? A relatively common ailment in West Africa and the West Indies. Not generally so common among British sailors, unless these are the places they're traveling to. And so yellow fever was a common hazard for slave traders. It was something that they often picked up and was often deadly. So I'm kind of where I'm thinking all this is landing up is that the mariner isn't really redeemable, right? And that instead of telling his story to save some other soul, right? He's instead kind of driven to go out and doom other people, right? And I'm still not entirely satisfied with that reading. I don't know that I'll ever come up with a reading of this poem that I'm completely satisfied with. And I think that's one of the reasons why I like teaching it, is because I can't figure it the hell out. And that doesn't help you. Except that I do think it's good for you sometimes to see that there are problems in text that your instructors grapple with, or that we don't have all the answers. Right? So I can lay out a bunch of contexts here for you, and I can tell you what I think is going on here. But I can also tell that that this is not really a poem I feel like I have a really good, strong interpretation of. Right? So I would leave it to you to try to answer some of the questions that I've raised here and try to come up with a reading that you think works for this particular poem. Right? I tried to lay out the pieces here as best I can. But I'm going to leave it to you to try to make sense of it. All right, so for next time, we're going to be reading Dorothy Wordsworth's, some excerpts from Dorothy Wordsworth's journals. The big thing that I want you to keep in mind as you're reading is the issue of genre, right? These are journals. So they are not meant for public consumption. So I want you to think about how that shapes the content of Wordsworth's work, right? Like how how does this affect what she includes and what she doesn't, right? The idea that maybe no one else is going to read these.